let Steve take over. Just wanted to ask if there are any questions from last week, and I'll have just a little bit of a wrap up from last week. If there aren't any questions, I do want to just kind of go back to one of the last points that I made about kind of Luther's legacy today. And that is kind of regarding this concept that we all have a direct communication to God. That was so far ahead of its time, and one way to kind of realize that is to look at Vatican II. So Vatican II was Congress within the Catholic Church, started in 1962, went to 1965, and the result of that were some reforms in the Roman Catholic Church. One of those reforms was that the liturgy is now conducted in English or in the local language, depending on where you are in the world. Before that, it had been done in Latin. So I have my wife grew up in a Catholic family, and many of her older relatives remember those days. Sometimes I think we overemphasize that in the sense that we kind of position it as they were trying to keep it secret, what was going on. It really wasn't that, especially, in modern memory. It was very common to get a worship folder where it would print what was happening in Latin, and then next to it, it would print the English. So it was certainly possible to kind of follow along if you didn't know Latin as to what was happening. But 1960s is when they stopped using Latin as the lingua franca. The other reform that I wanted to just mention is they really did make an effort from that point, clearly spelled it out, that lay people were to have a bigger part in the role of the church. Again, something that Luther was all about, way back when. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting to look at how those things finally filtered into the Roman Catholic Church. Any other thoughts or questions? If not, I will let Steve kind of take over with part two here.
Okay, let's look at our schedule again. May 11th, can we compare the Lutheran Church with other Protestant churches? Well, of course we can, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. First, I want to point out, next week, May 18th, there will be no class. The reason for that is we're having a very special worship service next week. For the last part of the worship service, we will be here in this room. And so it won't be set up for class. The furniture is going to be different. And we just thought, on the adult education team, we just thought to have to shoo people out after worship and reset everything for class, that'll just be too much. So we decided just to cancel class next week. And it'll be so much easier that way if we don't have to scramble after church to get things reset. So then 2 weeks from now, Paul is going to take over again and talk about how the ELC is different from other Lutheran denominations. So today, how comparing the Lutheran Church with other Protestant churches. I'm taking most of my material from a book called Honoring Our Neighbor's Faith. Unfortunately, this is a very good book. Unfortunately, it was published about 30 years ago, so a lot of the material is out of date already. But it's the best book I have. I can probably find a more up-to-date book, but it's what I already had at home. So I'll try to mention when I think the material is out of date. Having mentioned that book, I'm going to bring up a slide that's not from the book. This is something I found on the internet, and I have a problem. I have a couple of problems with this chart as well, but it's nice and clear, easy to read, but I'll mention when a couple of places that I have a problem with it. Of course, you can see that I cut it off where this goes all the way back, Roman Catholic, and even before the Catholic Church, before all the way back to the earliest forms of Christianity. But we're focused on other Protestant churches here in this class. So I started with the first divisions in the Protestant church after the Reformation. So you can see from this chart, there's 4 main branches of the Protestant church: Lutheran, Anglican, Reformed, and Anabaptist. And we'll talk a little bit about those branches, and then you see how the Protestant churches branched off from those. Not going to talk about Lutheran very much because Paul's going to do that in 2 weeks, except to compare certain other Protestant churches with Lutheranism. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of these boxes. I'm just going to pick out a few of the largest denominations in the United States to talk about. You can see one of the most important branches is Anglican. I'm not going to talk specifically about Anglican. I'm going to talk about Episcopalian, which is the United States version of Anglican. After the Revolutionary War, you see that church in the United States could no longer declare allegiance to the British crown, right? So the Anglican Church became the Episcopal Church in the United States. So that's the version of Anglican I'm going to talk about here. Then we have Reformed, another version of the Protestant Church, mainly in Europe. There are Reformed churches in the United States, but the most common version of the Reformed Church is Presbyterian. I'm going to talk about the Presbyterian Church in the United States. The other major branch, which we don't run into very much in the United States, is Anabaptist. Anabaptist means to re-baptize. That branch was, they believe in what's called believer's baptism. In other words, you come to faith first before you are baptized. And you're going to say, well, that sounds like the Baptist Church. And that is, in fact, one of the problems I have with this chart, is that the Baptist Church shows no connection with Anabaptist here on the chart, right? In fact, they do have a connection with the Anabaptists, and I'll get into that when I talk about the Baptist Church. And then, of course, the Anabaptists, off of that branch, we get the Mennonites and the Amish. I'm not going to talk about those. They're fairly small in number and not connected with other branches of the Protestant Church. We can see that the Anglicans spawned several other denominations. The Methodist Church is a pietist offshoot of Anglicans. The Methodists thought that the Anglicans were too liberal, especially in terms of things like drinking alcohol, dancing, playing cards, and all of those evils of the world, right? So they split off of the Anglican Church, and John Wesley formed a new denomination that banned those evils, especially drinking alcohol. I've got a story to tell you about that. I don't know whether to tell it now or when I get to the Methodist Church specifically. I'll go ahead and tell it now. It's an interesting story. See, the Anglicans used and use wine in their communion services, but the Methodists, they don't want to do that. They didn't want to do that. Obviously, it contains alcohol because of the alcohol content. So they used grape juice. But the problem is, this was back in the 1800s, before refrigeration. You can't leave grape juice sitting out. It spontaneously ferments because of wild yeast. And then it becomes wine, right? Well, an early Methodist who was a chemist discovered a way to make grape juice shelf stable so it won't spontaneously ferment. His name was Welch. He invented Welch's grape juice, a way of keeping bottles of grape juice on the shelf and keeping them free from fermentation so you can keep them on the shelf. So when you buy a bottle of grape juice off the shelf, you can thank the Methodists for that. Another offshoot of the Anglicans were the Separatists, from which we get the Puritan Church, and this chart derives the Baptists from that branch of the Anglican Church. I think the Baptists are, historically, yes, the early Baptists were previously members of the Anglican Church, but theologically, the Baptists were more closely connected with the Reformed and the Anabaptist churches, theologically speaking. Let's see if anything else I wanted to say. Did I mention Anabaptist means to rebaptize? They believed in believer's baptism. You came to faith first and then you were baptized. So if you had been baptized as an infant and therefore couldn't remember your baptism, you had to be baptized again as an adult, and therefore the name Anabaptist. Another thing I want to mention. On this chart, it shows Unitarian Universalist with a dotted line connecting to the Congregationalist movement. If I had done this chart, I don't think I would have put Unitarian Universalist on the chart at all. They're not really a Christian church, actually. You don't have to be a Christian to join Unitarian Universalist churches. For one thing, Unitarian refers to the unity of God. They're not a Trinitarian church. So I don't know. I think I would have just left them off altogether. But that's my opinion.
I think another thing that makes it confusing is that some of the newer movements, some of the mega churches and whatnot, don't fit into any of those categories.
Yeah.
They're taking a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, you know.
Yeah.
And so it is, you have to take this with a grain of salt.
You really do. That's true. The connection of non-denominational to Pentecostal is, you got to take that with a grain of salt. You're right. Okay. Having seen how all of these are connected, maybe, possibly, sort of, I'm going to move on to these individual squares. And like I said, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I've just chosen a few of them to talk about. First, the Episcopal Church. As I said, Episcopal Church is a part of the worldwide Anglican Communion. It had to separate itself politically from the Anglican Church after the American Revolution because they could no longer declare allegiance to the English monarch. So it was a political separation. And we'll see that whole Anglican Episcopal Church had a lot of political differences. Yes? Well, the British, the churches that are a member of the British Commonwealth do. I can't say that all Anglican churches everywhere do that. Yeah, but there are many Anglican churches that are in Commonwealth nations. You know, like Canada, Australia. Many Anglican churches in those countries. Yeah, the United States was not a part of England. In fact, it probably would have been considered treasonous to do so.
Isn't King Charles the titular head of the Anglican Church?
Yeah, right.
I think technically whoever the monarch is,
Who's ever monarch of England is considered to be the head of the church. So, yeah. Yeah.
It's ironic because of Henry VIII and why there is an Episcopal Church to begin with.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry, Henry VIII was the one who got his people to split from Rome.
Yes, yeah, Henry the. I'll get there, but you're right. Yes, Henry VIII. Exactly. He was considered the founder of the Church of England. In fact, let's get into this. The Episcopal Church. My first bullet point was political in origin, and that's exactly why. It's because Henry VIII wanted a boy. He wanted a son to cement his power. A girl wasn't quite good enough, right? Because according to the rules of succession in the British Empire, a boy was much better, right? At that time, the rules of succession have changed, by the way, but at that time, all of the boys were considered as successors to the king before all of the girls, okay? Eventually, Henry VIII did have a son, but only one, and when that son died, then they had to resort to the daughters, and I'll get into that. So Henry VIII wanted a male heir. His wife at that time, Henry VIII's wife at that time, Catherine of Aragon, had only a daughter who would become the future Queen Mary I, right? She did after. Well, I'll get there. So now Henry VIII tried to pursue an annulment from the Catholic Pope. The Pope refused. Well, that created a problem. So Henry had Parliament declare him the head of the Church of England. So that's where the split came in. At that point, since Henry VIII was the head of the church, he gave himself an annulment. And problem solved. So his marriage was annulled, and Henry VIII then went on to marry Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had a child, but woe is woe, it was a daughter.
She had one job.
Yeah, right? Her one job was to produce a son, and she did not. She produced another daughter who would become the future Elizabeth I. A few years later, unsurprisingly so, Anne Boleyn was executed for treason. Henry married for a third time Jane Seymour, and finally a son was born, who would become Edward VI, Henry VIII's only son. The monarch in power determined the direction of the church, since the monarch in power was the head of the church. Edward VI was only a boy when his father Henry died, which, practically speaking, meant that the Archbishop of Canterbury pulled the political strings in the country. The Archbishop of Canterbury at the time was Thomas Cranmer, who was strongly leaned toward the Reformed Church, he and his bishops. So the Church of England became strongly a Reformed church at that time. He was sympathetic to Lutheran and Calvinist ideas. If Edward VI had reigned for a long time, the Church of England today would probably be a Reformed church. But Edward only ruled for 6 years. He died as a teenager. His reign was only 6 years. His successor, remember Edward was an only son, When Edward died, they had to resort to daughters. So Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, became Mary I of England. Mary was a devout Catholic, and the pendulum swung in the other direction. The Church of England swung back to the papacy. Mary made it very difficult for Protestants in England at that point. She had the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer executed, not just for religious reasons. Remember, the Archbishop pulled the political strings too, because he was the head of the church. She had to get rid of him for political reasons. She also had 2 of his bishops burned at the stake for the same reason. I mean, this is like Game of Thrones, you know. So she returned the church to papal control. One of the things she wasn't able to do is return the church to the Latin language in the Mass. It was always in English. The people of England were not too happy about returning to the papal control. When Queen Mary died, the people of England were not exactly torn up about that. Then King Henry VIII's second daughter took the throne, Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth tried to broker a compromise. She was tired of all of this fighting and swinging back and forth between Catholic and Reformed. So Elizabeth tried to broker an agreement, and she was largely successful, although there were some on one side and the other that weren't happy with this middle ground. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the Baptist Church, because they were ones that weren't happy. They were on the extreme Protestant side, and they weren't happy about this middle ground. But it certainly explains why the Anglican and therefore Episcopal Church today has a little bit of both, some Roman Catholic-like practices and some Protestant practices. Well, after that little bit of history, this is kind of an eye chart. You're probably not going to be able to read that, but I'm just going to talk about just a very few of the similarities and differences between Episcopalians and Lutherans. Both accept the Apostles' and Nicene creeds. Both accept the Bible as the Word of God. The Episcopalians, just as a reminder, the Lutherans have 2 sacraments, baptism and communion. I don't know if we have any brand new Lutherans in here, but we have 2 sacraments. The Episcopalians celebrate 2 sacraments, but they observe 5 additional sacramentals, is what they call them. Now, you remember Catholics have 7 sacraments. And I'll refer to my notes here so I don't forget any. The Roman Catholic sacraments are baptism, communion, confession, confirmation, marriage, ordination, and last rites. Okay? Martin Luther said, no, there are only 2. This middle ground that Elizabeth I carved out kept all 7, but sort of demoted 5 of them, right? Episcopalians believe in Christ's real presence in communion. Some explain it as only spiritual. Others are close to the Roman Catholic view of transubstantiation. Well, there's a jargon word. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. Lutherans believe that believe in Christ's real presence in communion, and what Luther meant by that was that the true body and blood of Christ is present in, with, and under the bread and wine. Okay. Now, I learned from Paul just a couple of weeks ago that the German word unter most often translated as under, can also mean among. And that may be what Luther really meant, in, with, and among, which really makes a little more sense than under in that context. So we might want to think about that. But anyway, in the Roman Catholic Church, it has been the traditional official belief that the bread and wine is actually physically transformed into Christ's body and blood, physically human flesh and blood. Now, I think that the thinking about that has been changing a bit, especially among the Catholic laity in the United States. But it's always been the traditional doctrine of the Catholic Church that there's a physical change that happens during consecration of the elements. And that change is called transubstantiation. So, in the Episcopal Church, apparently some of the people think of it more closely in the way that the Roman Catholics think of it. Another difference is Episcopalians insist on apostolic succession. That is, the bishops must be ordained in an unbroken line back to the apostles. They have a ceremony of laying on of hands. Whereas in the Lutheran Church, apostolic succession is understood as continuity with the apostles' teaching. Although since we came into table fellowship with the Episcopalians, I understand that there is a laying on of hands ceremony during Lutheran ordination as well. So we have compromised a bit because of that table fellowship with the Episcopalian Church. Worship. Both the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church, the worship is liturgical. But it's much more strict in the Episcopal Church. They follow the Book of Common Prayer. There's not much variation from the Book of Common Prayer. It's pretty much fixed. Whereas in the Lutheran Church, the basic order is followed, followed by custom and church statements. But we have quite a bit more freedom than the Episcopal Church does in worship service. Government. The Episcopal Church, an Episcopal form with 3 ranks of clergy, bishops, priests, and deacons. The government of the Episcopal Church is democratic and congregations have considerable freedom. Lutherans, the book says, interdependent, congregational, regional, national, and global expressions of the church characterized by democratic decision-making, strong ecumenical relationships, elected leadership, and an ordained ministry. Well, that's quite a mouthful, but I think we all know what that means. Here in our local congregation, we have a church council, an ordained minister, but we have a regional Oregon Synod with a bishop. We have a national bishop and a national organization, and we all know what that means. Characteristics. According to this book, the Episcopal Church has great appeal to upper and middle class people, although it attracts all classes and races. Whereas the Lutherans strongly appeal among the middle class, although not exclusively so. Membership, Episcopal Church, 2,536,550 members with 7,415 congregations. Remember, this book was written 30 years ago, as I mentioned earlier. Lutheran Church, membership, 5,180,910 with 10,936 congregations as of 30 years ago. Okay.
Just real quickly on the apostolic succession, I've been to a number of ordinations, and it's interesting when it is a male who's being ordained. It is very common to see quite a few clergy from other denominations at the ordination, even if it's a Lutheran ordination. A lot of clergy from other denominations take it very seriously, this idea of apostolic succession, and almost feel it's their duty to come and be a part of that tradition. When it's a female who's being ordained, not so many seem to show up.
Oh, no. Yeah. Methodist Church, let's move on. By the way, I'm not putting these in alphabetical order, although right now it might appear so, but I sort of arranged these as the closest to Lutheran theology and moving further away as we go, okay? The Episcopal Church is really quite close to Lutheranism. Methodist, not so much. I'm going to be moving on to Presbyterian and then Baptist to end the class. Okay, Methodist beginnings. Oh, first, any other questions about the Episcopal Church? Okay. Also, I'll have to say I'm not an expert in any of these churches, especially with the Episcopal Church. I'm relying on this book. I know a little bit more about the Methodist Church. My mother was a Methodist before she married my father and converted to Lutheranism. Also, when I was on the call committee we were considering a number of candidates, including Pastor Allison, but the Synod office asked us if we would be willing to consider pastors from other denominations. Well, at that time, we had had a very good experience with Pastor Laurie, who was a Presbyterian. So we said, sure, we aren't going to exclude anybody. You can give us names from other denominations. And so, in fact, we got names. One name was a Presbyterian, and one name was it wasn't Pastor Laurie, by the way. That's not allowed. But one name was a Presbyterian, and one name was a Methodist. Well, I decided I needed to do a little bit more research into the beliefs of Methodists and Presbyterians. So I did. And so I know a little bit more about the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church than I do about the others. Okay, Methodist Church, Methodist beginnings. Methodists started out as a pietist movement, pietist offshoot from the Anglican Church. And I told you my story about the grape, using the grape juice in communion, and the Methodist chemist who figured out how to keep it from turning into wine spontaneously. The Methodist Church appealed primarily to the labor classes not reached by the Anglican Church. I think I mentioned in my comparison to Lutheranism that the Episcopal Church appealed primarily to the upper and middle classes. That was true of the Anglican Church in England too. They didn't really reach the labor class, the working class very much. Methodists did. Wesley tried to appeal to that of the working class of people. When the Methodists came to the United States, they did a lot of spreading their message by circuit riders, preachers traveling from town to town on horseback. There were quite a bit in the United Methodist Church in the United States, there were quite a bit of divisions and reunions. The Methodist Protestant Church, that's a formal name, Methodist Protestant Church, split off in 1830. In 1844, the original body divided into North and South, the Northern Methodists and the Southern Methodists. In 1939, those three branches, the Methodist Protestant Church and the Northern Methodists and the Southern Methodists, got back together again as the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church and a second denomination, the Evangelical United Brethren Church, united in 1968 and became the United Methodist Church. That's what we know today. And it's interesting, as I was researching the Methodist Church, as I said I did when I was on the call committee, I was particularly interested in what they thought about Holy Communion, okay? If we were going to have a Methodist preside at our communion service, I wanted to know what Methodists thought about communion. Well, I looked at these constituent bodies, including the Evangelical United Brethren Church. Their foundational document about Holy Communion, I swear it could have been written by Martin Luther. Very close to Lutheran beliefs. Now, during the merger with the United Brethren Church, with the Methodist Church, it got watered down, right, as often happens with mergers. So today's United Methodist Church belief about communion is not as strongly connected with the Lutheran belief about communion, but it's still pretty close. Approach to faith. John Wesley preached that the grace and love of God are available to all. But we have a role to play in salvation, and that is to respond to God's love and mercy, to decide to accept God's forgiveness, and to trust Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Oh, John, you just missed it by a little bit. Not quite the grace as Lutherans think of it, but you almost got there. And again, my table about comparing Methodists and Lutherans. Methodists believe the Bible contains the Word of God. The book says much disagreement here. I don't know exactly what disagreement it is, but the book says much disagreement among Methodists. Lutherans, of course, accept the Bible as the written witness to God's revelation of saving action through Jesus Christ. Methodists teach justification by faith, same as Lutherans. Methodists consider baptism and Holy Communion not only symbolically, but also as signs of God's grace. But notice the word signs. Lutherans consider baptism and Holy Communion as God's means of conveying God's grace. So that's a difference. Methodists teach that all people have the ability to choose the good and turn to God. Ability to choose. That's one of John Wesley's expressions. Lutherans teach that we can reject God, but it is only God's work that brings us to faith. Methodists believe the church should express its faith in concrete actions in the affairs of the world. There's a lot of social justice work in the Methodist Church. Lutherans believe the church lives to preach the gospel and celebrate the sacraments, giving strength for service in the world. This is quite a generalization, and in fact, I think it's changed a bit in the last 30 years, but it's primarily the church's work to equip its members to serve justice to the world. It's not really a difference in practice, but a difference in emphasis.
Well, I'd say there's one difference. I've done some volunteer work with schools here in Beaverton, and there are Methodist churches that will basically take off Sunday and have a work day in the school.
Okay.
And so they're kind of establishing it as this is your duty to go and do these good things.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And we would never consider taking off Sunday to go and
do that. Yeah.
We would encourage people to go volunteer in the school, but
probably not skip church to do that. Yeah. Right. Okay, thanks, Paul. That's a good point. Worship. Methodists formally very free and emotional. In fact, the Pentecostal church was an offshoot of the Methodist church, right? Now moving toward more dignified and sometimes highly liturgical patterns. And of course, Lutherans liturgical following the classic forms of the Western church. Government, Episcopal with bishop but no claim to apostolic succession. Congregations quite free within clearly defined channels. And I've already read that mouthful of words describing Lutheran government about congregational, regional, and national. Oh, one interesting thing that we learned in the call committee about the Methodist Church is the Methodists assign pastors much more like the Catholic Church assigns priests. They don't have call committees in Methodist churches. The government of the church assigns pastors, and most often for short periods of time, like 3 years. You don't have a situation like we had at St. Andrew where Pastor Mark stayed here for 17 years. That doesn't happen. They move pastors around. The pastors essentially don't work for the congregation. They're moved around like priests in Catholic churches. Characteristics, Methodist Church, major emphasis on Christian living as the fruit of personal commitment and clear understanding of Christian doctrine. Leaders in movements for reunion of Christian communities of faith. Lutherans' strong emphasis on a correct doctrine with Christian life to proceed from belief as faith becomes active in love. Cautious about cooperation with other religious groups without doctrinal agreement. So these agreements that we have, like with the Episcopal Church, Lutherans tend to be picky about making sure that there's enough agreement before making deals like that. Statistics, Methodist Church membership, about 8.5 million congregations, 36,000, and we've already talked about the statistics of the Lutheran Church. Again, these numbers are 30 years old, probably have changed a lot. Any questions about Methodism? Yes?
Steve, what is the difference between a Methodist and a free Methodist?
And
The difference between Methodist and free Methodist.
free Methodist. I'll have to confess I don't know what a free Methodist is.
Gretchen and I tried to look it up, and it's not real clear here. So it is different. I was hoping you had an answer.
I don't know what a free Methodist is, no, sorry.
I think it's fair to say that the Free Methodists broke off from the Methodists, and so the free implies, separate from the other Methodists. But that's about as far as I can go.
I would assume that split has been fairly recent because my 30-year-old book here doesn't mention Free Methodist. I don't know. Anything else? Okay, I want to hurry along here because I've got 2 more to do, Presbyterian and Baptist. The Presbyterian Church. Presbyterian history. First, we have to talk about John Calvin and the Reformed Church because the Presbyterians came out of the Reformed tradition in Europe. John Calvin went from France to Geneva, Switzerland. And in Geneva, Switzerland, he acquired much knowledge and information from a reformer named Zwingli. Zwingli is very famous and maybe even you could say a historical hero in Geneva. Martin Luther is a historical hero in Germany, but if you go to Geneva, there are statues of Zwingli all over the place. And so Calvin learned a lot from Zwingli, and he was a brilliant young man. I think he was something like 24 years old when he arrived in Geneva, did a lot of work and a lot of building of the Reformed movement in Geneva. Now we go back to England, specifically Scotland, and we have to talk about a man named John Knox. John Knox traveled from Scotland to Geneva as a refugee. Remember Queen Mary, who was a devout Catholic and made it so tough on Protestants? John Knox was a refugee, a Protestant refugee that fled Scotland and traveled to Geneva and met John Calvin there and learned about the Reformed movement from John Calvin. That's who he got his education from, and became a convert to the Reformed movement. I mean, John Knox was already a Protestant, but he's got his education in Reformed theology from John Calvin. Then, of course, Queen Mary died. Elizabeth I brokered that agreement between Catholics and Protestants in England. After she died, her son took the throne. King James, as in the King James Version of the Bible, was the next king on the throne. It was safe for John Knox to return to Scotland. He brought his Reformed learning back and started the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. It's interesting how, I don't know if you've ever seen the cartoon The Sorcerer's Apprentice, when Mickey Mouse tries to chop up the out-of-control broom, and all he succeeds in doing is splitting it into 1,000 pieces, and they turn into little brooms, right? Trying to snuff out these religious movements, more often than not, only succeeds in causing them to spread, right? So trying to snuff out Protestantism in England just spread it all over the world. So John Knox returned to Scotland under King James. From there were many immigrants to America that brought the Presbyterian Church with them. I'll just mention one name in particular. John Witherspoon came to the state of New Jersey, with a colony at that time of New Jersey, to head up a college in New Jersey that later became known as Princeton University. Became eventually a real center of education for the Presbyterian Church. He was also a minister, and interesting fact, was the only minister to have signed the Declaration of Independence. Theological concern of Presbyterians. There are no real novelties in the Presbyterian Church, but we can talk about accent and emphasis. Just as a comparison, Lutherans have an emphasis on grace. Methodists, God's grace. Methodists have an emphasis on God's love. Presbyterians have an emphasis on God's sovereignty and humanity's duty to obey God's sovereignty. There's a lot in Presbyterian theology about obedience to God. Comparison chart. Presbyterians, the Bible is regarded as the witness without parallel to Jesus Christ, who is the one sufficient revelation of God. Lutherans, Bible regarded as the written witness to God's revelation of saving action through Jesus Christ. Now, you'll notice that in many cases, there's not an awful lot of difference. Again, it's more about accent and emphasis. Presbyterians accept Nicene and Apostles' Creeds. There are many other documents here. The Scots Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Second Helvetic Confession, on and on. There's one thing I do want to mention, a particular document, the Declaration of Barmen. The Barmen Declaration, that was something that was written in the 1930s, during the Nazi control of Germany. It was written by a theologian by the name of Karl Barth, arguably the finest theologian in the Reformed tradition of the 20th century in Europe. The Barmen Declaration was written in response to Hitler's attempt to make the Reformed Church an arm of the state. And Karl Barth wrote a scathing rebuke of that attempt. So that's a very important document in of the Reformed tradition. Point 3, Presbyterians consider the sacraments as visible signs of an invisible grace, confirming our faith in the proclaimed word. Of course, Lutherans consider the sacraments as actual channels of God's grace to us, means of grace. Presbyterians believe that in communion, the body and blood of Christ are really present, but received spiritually. In my research on the Presbyterian Church, it appeared to me that first, all of these denominations believe in what's called the real presence of Christ in communion, but the sticker here is, what do they mean by the words real presence? Okay. Presbyterians believe in the real presence of Christ at the ceremony of communion, but not necessarily in, with, and under the bread and wine like Lutherans do. Okay? So there's the difference. Christ is really present, but not in, with, and under the bread and wine, or in, with, and among the bread and wine. Worship varies from liturgical to free, usually with sermon as the climax. For Lutherans, most often it's Holy Communion that is the climax of the service, but with Presbyterians, very often the pulpit is at the center of their worship space. Government, ruled by a series of courts in which the elders elected by the people share authority with the ministers. There are 4 levels of church courts. In fact, the word Presbyterian refers to that form of government, church government. And we've already read the mouthful of words that define Lutheran government, so I won't reread it. Presbyterian characteristics, major concern for the church's work in facing the needs of society. In practice, leavened bread and grape juice used in communion. I've already mentioned the deal about the grape juice. Distributed to worshipers in the pew. They come to you. It's delivered. Lutherans, not as active in social involvement, but faith to be practiced in life. Unleavened or leavened bread and wine used in communion. Well, you know, we've moved to offer grape juice as well, so things have changed. Elements received by communicants at the chancel. If we have new Lutherans here, the chancel is the raised area at the front of the worship space. But we also offer delivery as well for people who aren't able to make it up to the chancel. Statistics, Presbyterians, 2,600,000 roughly members, 11,000 and change congregations. And we've already read the statistics for Lutherans. Any questions about Presbyterians? Okay. We know something about Presbyterians from Pastor Laurie being here. Baptists, I'll try to finish this up. We're getting short on time, but I really do want to talk about the Baptists because they have a rather complicated lineage. Baptist beginnings. They started in England too, but they started during this swing of the pendulum, also during this Catholic Protestant fight in England. I've already talked about the Edward VI Reformed and Mary I, Roman Catholic, and Elizabeth I, the middle way, the compromiser, and that she was largely successful, but left the people on the extremes unsatisfied with the middle way. The beginnings of the Baptist Church were among those who were unsatisfied on the extreme Protestant side. They were called the Separatists, and some of them were refugees that went to Holland, Amsterdam, Holland, where they ran into a group of religious folks called the Anabaptists. And that's where they picked up this idea of believer's baptism, that people should be baptized after they come to faith, not as infants. That's where the Baptists pick up this adult baptism idea, and not infant baptism. So when it was safe for them to return to England, they did so, and they brought these Baptist ideas back with them. And then, of course, when the English started to move to the United States, they brought their Baptist belief with them. Now, because they were on the extreme Protestant side, they took some of their ideas from the Reformed tradition, as it was in England during that time, and some of their ideas from the Anabaptists, including the idea of adult baptism. So in that chart that I showed at the beginning of the class, where they showed the Baptists springing off of the Anglican Church, well, that's true. Most of the people had been members of the Anglican Church, but theologically, the Baptists get most of their ideas either from the Reformed tradition or from the Anabaptist tradition. That's one of the complaints I have about that chart, is that it's a lot more complicated than the chart would seem to indicate. Baptists in the United States. You may have heard about Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island. He was not a Baptist when he first came to the United States, but he was a believer in religious freedom, and he came to the United States to escape persecution in England. He first settled in Massachusetts, ran into persecution there, had to flee to what was then called Indian Territory, settled in Rhode Island, got a charter to establish a state, the state that would be known as Rhode Island, founded the city of Providence, and made the state of Rhode Island a haven for those who had undergone religious persecution, including the Baptists coming from England. Some basic Baptist principles. Baptists claim to be a New Testament church, including things like, this they got from the Anabaptist tradition, including living communally as disciples, believers' baptism, adult baptism, a congregational church structure. Each congregation is fairly independent. I know we talk about like the Southern Baptist Convention, but that's a fairly loose association of congregations. It's not a very strong church government. Religious freedom at all levels. Baptists chafe at the idea of having their religion controlled. Okay? Direct access to God. Scripture as sole authority for teaching and belief, especially literal scripture as the basis for teaching and belief. Teachings. Baptists accept the Bible as Word of God. Some conservative Baptists, very literal in interpretation. Not all Baptists. There are some progressive Baptists, for example, the American Baptist denomination, are quite progressive. Baptists accept no creeds, with each person to interpret the Bible for him or herself. Baptists refuse to use creeds as a test of faith. Practice only believer's baptism, that is, you come to faith first, and then you're baptized. They believe immersion is the only scriptural method of baptism. They practice two ordinances, not sacraments, but ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper. Communion is considered a sign of salvation, not a means of grace. Worship free and generally unstructured according to the choice of congregation and minister. Government, congregational form regarded as the only scriptural type. Some joint work through conventions, as Southern Baptist Convention. Characteristics, stress placed on personal conversion, sometimes with accompanying emotional experience. strongly opposed to mixture of church and state. Now, remember, this is 30 years old, because today, many Baptist churches are home to what are called Christian nationalists, who are definitely not opposed to mixture of church and state. But that wasn't so common 30 years ago. Membership is big, over 34 million members with almost 90,000 congregations. Again, statistic 30 years old. I won't read the Lutheran side because we've probably heard enough about that at this time. We're at the end of our time. Any questions about the Baptists or anything else I've talked about? Yes?
I wasn't Baptist, but just a little time in college. In college, you try lots of a lot of things. And I did try some of that, but I did it my own way because it just didn't fit me. But 50 years later, I still have friends from them, and they've moved all kinds of different places, but they said that I helped them look at other things beyond Baptist. So I guess I was a Baptist, but I wasn't a very good, but one of my friends does not go to her Baptist church in a small place in Louisiana because she's too open that they won't, and so, and her husband goes, she will not go. But she went up to St. Louis to meet with other women who want to be women in the ministry. And the Southern Baptists are not interested in that.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, all of the people that I've known and how they've changed in the last years. And so I'm assuming that the Baptist is like any other group, has done a lot of change. And that's why it would be nice to have a new book. I hope you can find one.
Yeah, as I said, there is a small denomination called American Baptist Church that tends to be much more progressive. We have friends that are American Baptists, and they jokingly refer to themselves as the Good Baptists. So that's something a Baptist who is more progressive might want to check out that small denomination.
I refreshed my memory a little bit on the Methodist, Free Methodist. So the Free Methodists broke off in 1860. They felt that the Methodists were not conservative enough. But one interesting thing, so what was the topic of the day in 1860? Slavery, exactly. The Methodists, the big Methodists, did not take a position formally. Now, they'll be quick to remind you today that there were lots of Methodists who were very anti-slavery, and that is true. But the Free Methodists very specifically were anti-slavery. And that's part of where the free comes in, as in free person.
Okay.
Now, the catch is that they are still very conservative, so they are very anti-LGBTQ today, you know, so, yeah.
Okay, all right, thanks, Paul. Thank you. All right. Okay, if there are no more questions, any other questions I want to give people a chance to ask? Seeing none, thank you for coming today. No class next week, and Paul's going to talk all about the Lutherans next week. And I asked him a specific question today. What about this word synod? We talk about the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod, but oh my gosh, we have synods in the ELCA too. Clear up the confusion, please, Paul, for us in 2 weeks.